All right, everybody. So we're here to do a sort of ecology type lecture on exploration and colonization of the Americas. And this is for, let's see, we're going to do grade 4. So this was something that you can go back to. I'll try to break it into parts so you don't have to watch one long video or anything like that. I apologize if it's a little bit boring. I'll do my best for you. So our story of exploration is an interesting one. We're going to start with this before and after type date of 1492. Haha, that didn't work out. 1492. And of course, Columbus sails the ocean blue. Now, there's lots of things that we can talk about in the before and after of 1492. I mean, a lot of people get into like Leif Erikson, the essentially really a Viking who was coming over and made it to Canada or Newfoundland in like the year 1004. 1004, Leif Erikson. I don't know how to spell his last name, but you get the idea. And then there were Portuguese. Portuguese were incredible fishermen, and they were fishing also off the coast of Maine, and they would dry the cod on the rocks on the coast of Maine, and then they would bring it back to Europe. However, none of these really mattered to history, if you ask me and many other people, because they were doing this for much of the time and it didn't amount to anything. Whereas Columbus, his real contribution is like the public relations. After Columbus makes his voyage, the world is profoundly different, and it really marks this massive transatlantic migration. For the first time, the meeting of the old and the new worlds, and this is gonna be Portuguese. I think it must have a Portuguese. Huh. Anyway, Portuguese. Oh, there it is. There's a U in there, and so. The first thing we need to answer, which I think we should start with, is why 1492? And we were explaining, if you recall, that the Muslims had an empire, and that empire was from essentially 711 to 1492. And it didn't begin in 711 and end in 1492. Those are the approximate dates, and there are events associated with them. But you get the idea. And this was the leading empire in the world. Leading empire in the world. And they led in knowledge. They led in inventions, such as they invented algebra, for instance. And they were the most prosperous. Prosperous. And part of the reason that they were so prosperous is because they were in the middle. And they were in between China and Europe. And the middleman often makes a lot of money, and that's what was happening during this time, as we'll get into a little bit later. So let's see. The Muslims, we had mentioned, they were in the Iberian Peninsula. Which is Spain and Portugal. I'm not going to try to spell it this time. And so southern Spain in particular had like this big university, and it was a center of learning. And in 1492, we know this story partially from Columbus. We had Ferdinand. He was probably from Castile. And Isabella, she was from another another kingdom, I suppose. I feel like she was from Aragon. And they were both Christian, and they attacked the Muslims and kicked them out. So this was called an event called the Reconquista, the reconquest of Spain or the Iberian Peninsula. And they defeated the Moors, and the Moors are really the Muslims who were living in the Iberian Peninsula. So, with that in mind, they, for whatever reason, and I'm not really clear on this, but somehow were still a knowledge center, and particularly in the realm of navigation. So, what are we talking about there? We're talking about navigational technology, and that's a big deal at that point. So, what are we getting at? We're going with the magnetic compass, which is good for north and south. And then we have the astrolabe, which helped with figuring out how far from the equator you are, what line of latitude, how far from the equator. And then we have the compass, astrolabe, and the caravel, which use the lateen sail, which is triangular shaped, which helped in tacking, which is sailing into the wind. Okay, so these are three things that primed the Portuguese and the Spanish into the Age of Exploration, which is the period that we're headed for. And I don't know, the Age of Exploration is probably, it overlaps with other ages, just for the record. So it's not as if these things are exclusive, and they have blurred lines and so forth, but really we're talking about something like 1500 to probably 1800. It can be the Age of Exploration. If anything, it's a little bit shorter than that. Okay, so then we're going to the issue of motivation for exploration. And this is really a European phenomenon because the Muslims weren't motivated to explore, and neither really were the Chinese. So, with that in mind, the Europeans were unable to explore prior to gaining this new technology. Explore effectively. They were always within sight of the coastline, pretty much. They weren't very willing to go further out into the ocean, which is obviously necessary for transatlantic crossings. So, let's see. With motivation for exploration, it is really just coming down to money. And money can be in the shape, first and foremost, of spices. And it's hard to underestimate how lucrative the spice trade was. And we have a lesson for that we've already gone over. And there are great facts. You can just look up how valuable was the spice trade to medieval Europe. And so we can look those up. And I think I told you this story about this one ship. It took something like 22 years to get from Europe to Indonesia and back to Europe, but they made, that was enough for an entire lifetime. So first they wanted spices, and then of course they would have wanted gold, which initially was the Gold Coast of Africa. But very shortly it's going to be gold and silver and precious metals from the Americas. So some other sub-motivations, I think, that were less than money were fame of these navigators, as well as spreading Christianity. And we commonly refer to this as gold, God, and glory. Okay, so then we can ask the question, where were they going? And so their targets were the Far East. So this could include India, of the famous Indians, India. It could also include Indonesia. And then Southeast Asia, such as Vietnam and Thailand. All right. So that was the target. Now, previously, they were trying to get around the Silk Road. The Silk Road was this enormously long road that extended from the Far East to really Israel, and then trading would take place around the Mediterranean. So that's a fascinating story, the Silk Road, but they don't want to go the overland route. They want to go by sea. So first and foremost, they were going around Africa. And this was primarily the Portuguese. And so making it around I don't know whether it's the Cape Horn, I think it is, in South Africa, was a really big deal for them. And they would set up colonies along the way to supply the ships. And they would also be trading along the way. So you can imagine it sort of like a train of some sort. And so the Portuguese are early traders, or early explorers, and going around Africa and making it to the Indian Ocean was a big deal. But of course, some did get blown off course and found their way to Brazil, which didn't yield precious metals, but it yielded the next best thing, which was going to be sugar. And sugar is a cash crop, which is a single crop that can make a fortune of money. None was ever better than sugar, but cash crops also happen to be often labor intensive. So we're going to get to this a little bit later, but some other cash crops not in Brazil other than sugar are tobacco, rice, indigo, which is a blue dye, and eventually cotton. It's a shame that they're all very labor intensive because you know what we're getting at there. So who followed suit next was the Spanish. And that was really the beginning with Columbus. But there were others. Let's see, there was De Soto. I had mentioned that these guys didn't always fly under their own flags. I think Magellan was probably sailing for the Spanish as well, even though he was likely Italian too. So where were the Spanish going? It wasn't so much that the world is flat, not so much that the world was flat, although some people certainly probably thought that at the time. It was a question of how big the world was. I think I mentioned the other day how the Greeks knew the world was flat because of the crescent shadow that was formed on the moon. So Columbus thought the world was small and could be, the word is really circumnavigated, circumnavigated quickly. But others thought it was huge. And realistically, Columbus wouldn't have stood a chance at getting around the world if the Americas weren't there. He was probably lucky that he made it. He was drastically wrong about the tiny size of the Earth, according to him. So, that finding the Americas was a really big deal and is going to set off all sorts of things. But for now, that's part 1 of our series, and now we'll discover in the next segment what happened when Columbus and the other European nations and explorers got here.